Yes, my name is Sushank Pazaki. I'm a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Criminal Justice. And Dr. Maloney, Dr. Darno are my colleagues. And I don't want to miss any information. They have very impressive bios. So I'm going to, in order not to miss anything, I'm going to read basically about their background. And please hold your applause until I introduce both of them. So Dr. Carrie Maloney is an associate professor of criminal justice and the director of criminal justice program in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Criminal Justice at East Stroudsburg University. Dr. Maloney's primary area of expertise is juvenile justice, specifically with respect to risk assessment and classification in juvenile justice settings. Much of her work has focused on accountability of justice system practitioners, as well as the identification of best practices in the implementation of evidence-based practice in juvenile justice settings. And I'm sure probably she's going to talk a little bit about that. She was the recipient of one of ESU's major leveraging grant awards, which led to a successful grant from the National Institute of Justice. Dr. Maloney has been serving as a juvenile justice system reform consultant for the past 10 years in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Dr. Darno, also my colleague, is an assistant professor of criminal justice in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Criminal Justice at East Stroudsburg University. She has been teaching at ESU since the fall of 2015. Dr. Darno's teaching interests include Introduction to Criminal Justice, Criminology, Juvenile Delinquency, and Senior Seminar. Her research interests include deviance and crime on college campuses, parenting and delinquency, fear of victimization, and theory testing. Dr. Darno has published and presented research articles on topics of theory testing, crime on college campuses, issues within the criminal justice system, and rehabilitation techniques, and some other topics. Please join me to welcome our presenters.
Thank you, Dr. Pazaki. I want to thank everybody for coming, especially in this lovely weather that we're having right now. Thank you to the provost, of course, and the colloquium committee for giving us this opportunity. Dr. Darno and I are actually really excited to talk to you this evening about the research that we've been working on, which is titled, "Are We So Different?" A comparative examination of students' self-reported value prioritization and the perceived value prioritization of others. I know it's a mouthful, bear with me. Hopefully I won't stumble on the words myself as we try to kind of tell you really the story of how this project evolved, which is actually still ongoing. And so we've kind of stumbled upon what we think are really fun and exciting findings so far. So we're going to talk to you about that today and then tell you a little bit about where we'd like to go next with the project. As I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, this project evolved after I started doing a classroom exercise in an ethics course back in 2012. But a little bit about ethics in the classroom, particularly criminal justice ethics in the classroom. Incorporating it into the curriculum, I'm going to not forget to advance my slides. It's pretty universally accepted as best practice for a variety of reasons. Though I do tell my students often, you're lucky there's a criminal justice ethics class specifically now, as when I was an undergrad, I had to take 3 semesters of philosophy. That said, it is essential to fostering higher level analytic critical thinking skills, and it's really, really helpful for students to have that opportunity to explore the what ifs and the what would you do, and really challenge them to think about it also beyond what they know to be their chosen career path. Right? What is your moral obligation? What is it beyond your duty as a law enforcement officer or correctional officer? But what is your moral obligation as a human being? And so that's challenging for any student. I'm not going to say it's necessarily particularly challenging for criminal justice students, but of course, those are my beginnings with exploring this topic with my students. So it is pretty accepted. You won't really find many criminal justice curriculums out there that don't incorporate at least a full semester of ethics at this point. If they don't have a full semester of it, sometimes they do try to weave ethics in throughout the entire curriculum. The Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, which is one of the bodies it's a national organization that is responsible for the certification of criminal justice programs. They have a manual of standards for a criminal justice education guide, which includes at a minimum that you have an ethics course included. And really it's about, again, encouraging students to be informed citizens as they participate in the governmental process and consume criminal justice information. So all of that to say, you're not really going to come across a curriculum that doesn't have ethics, okay? As Dr. Darno is going to talk about later, though, how it gets incorporated and some of the research about how well we do in sort of delivering that information and ultimately what are our goals and how well are we doing with that can be a little bit mixed. And some of the research that's out there, in addition to what we're going to talk to you about, our research, I think, is sort of pretty exciting in terms of giving some really good potential to kind of revamp curriculum in some of those ways. Now, when it comes to ethics, I also just wanted to add, it's not particular, as most of you know, to criminal justice. Most majors and academic disciplines also do have ethics curricula, whether it's in their curriculum or ethics courses that they take. I'm not going to say in my potentially biased fashion that it's more important for criminal justice students to have ethics courses, but it certainly has very unique circumstances. And what I mean by that, all of these words share something in common, and that would be the criminal justice professional. Criminal justice professionals ultimately have authority and have power that no other citizens in the United States have. They are given an immense amount of responsibility. They alone can take away our rights, okay? They have discretion, and with that authority and power, right, they can restrict our freedom, okay? Our civil liberties. Now, they do so, presumably, lawfully, but in that, we would expect then that those individuals that are given that amount of power and trust are trustworthy, have sort of a good ethical frame, okay, a good kind of moral compass, if you want to call it that. And so, again, maybe not more important that we make sure our students coming out of criminal justice programs and going into the field study ethics, but definitely we're talking about what I believe is a pretty unique population. So, as mentioned, it was a classroom exercise, all right? A little bit more about that. In 2012 was the first time I did this classroom exercise with my students in a criminal justice ethics class, and this was at another university. And I continued it every semester that I taught ethics there, and then also here at East Stroudsburg. And it was taken directly from the textbook. The textbook is Ethical Dilemmas and Decisions in Criminal Justice by Jocelyn Pollack. And so what was asked of students, they were given a list of values. It was kind of a long list. I think there were 21, 22, 23 items, things like honesty, family, health, success, emotional well-being. So a list of 23 of these. And they were asked to do two things. The first thing they were asked to do was to rank them in order of importance for themselves, with number one being the most important. So of this list, what's the number one most important value to you? And then go from there and rank each and every one of them. The second thing they were asked to do was rank them again, only this time they had to rank them according to how they think most other people would rank that same set of values. And so the idea and sort of how it was posed in the book was to do a few different things. And the first was to illustrate the concept of values as distinct from morals, as distinct from ethics. So it started as, let's just talk about the basic concepts. But in addition to that, it was really to look at the relative prioritization. And the fact that when you look at things in terms of prioritization, for some students, everything on that list could be important. And so it encouraged them to think about what's more or less important than the other. Often what was going to happen is they were going to realize, well, I'm going to look at these 2, these 3, these 4 values, and I don't necessarily think one is more important than the other. So they had to actually think about situations, scenarios, dilemmas where they might come into kind of conflict with one another, and how would they decide how they would prioritize one over the other. And that might change from day to day, from situation to situation. And so while I told them, I'm only asking you to do 2 things, there's only 2 questions on the survey, you just have to do a ranking twice, I was really trying to encourage them to think a lot more about it. Or at least I was hoping that's what they were going to do. So we also, though, with that, or I also wanted to illustrate how our perceptions about others and how we believe they prioritize their personal values is often very different than how we prioritize our own. So it was not just about having them explore their own values, but what do they think other people value? And then to be able to see that side by side. So that would open up, hopefully, a dialogue about perception, where our perceptions stem from, and how that ultimately creates a lens for us. So we go out into the world with a lens. How do we view other people before we meet them, before we know anything? Do we have a lens that we're already starting to view them with? I always presented the results to my students, and I kept them every semester. And it was always really impactful to them. They were, pretty intrigued by the results. They kind of found it fun to see, what they did up on the screen, charts and graphs and all of that. But what struck me after time was I started to see semester after semester after semester some really interesting patterns happen over time with the students. Okay, and that really was the inspiration for this project and why I ultimately went into Dr. Darno's office and I said, I want to talk to you about this because I think it's really interesting. Or is it just me finding it interesting because, I like data and all that stuff?
So what we started talking about was how this stuff was connected to potentially personality, the lens that we view other people, what that meant. And that really got us thinking about how we could connect this to research that already exists concerning things like personality dictating what field you go into, and like things like the police subculture, police personality. So research is going to indicate that individuals may be drawn to certain fields due to things like personality. So yeah, individuals might be drawn to certain fields because maybe it's something that they're good at, but it also might be something like life experiences, personality choices, characteristics that make certain people fit in certain fields maybe more than others. Like I mentioned, this might simply be trying to find something that you're good at, or there might be something more to it. Many high school seniors, college students, the way they figure out career aptitude is through personality inventories. So they take sort of personality tests that sort of dictate which area they might be more interested in based on how they answer, even in some situations, ethical questions. So even something, as simple as the Myers-Briggs type indicator is going to make some kind of suggestions about what that person may be interested in, what that person may be good at based on personality characteristics. So part of this had to do with that. Part of this had to do with us kind of thinking how personal values and lens may potentially impact personality and how these things might engage with each other. In regard to criminal justice, this is often thought of when concerning police subculture, police personality. So certain people being drawn to certain fields for specifically criminal justice research is going to use these kind of things. So this is police subculture specifically, is the set of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that are thought to be attributed specifically to the policing profession. With this idea of police personality, what we have here is a couple different models that suggest how this might come about. So what we've got up there first is the predispositional model. So the idea that certain personalities might be drawn into and or hired into certain professions more than others. So with policing, this might mean that certain individuals who have this predisposition might be more likely to go into policing because of that predisposition. So it might have something to do with potentially authoritarianism, which we'll mention later on. But this isn't a complete or really agreed upon finding within those working in the field of policing. The socialization model is going to suggest that it's not necessarily predisposed, that it's going to be something that they learn on the job. So that's going to suggest that the police personality, police subculture, ideology kind of stuff is going to come through sort of like a byproduct of policing. So as the job itself forms, you learn what's expected of you. So you learn how to act, how to engage with others, these characteristics of the job while on the job. So we're not attempting to directly measure authoritarianism, what I mentioned earlier. That's not necessarily something that we had intended to really piece out of this, but in some ways it's going to be a little applicable. As far as how this connects to values, there's questions if these elements, in our minds at least, would impact the other. So if authoritarianism might have some kind of connection to personal values, or if that might have some kind of connection to police personality, or how these things come about. Like Dr. Maloney mentioned, CJ practitioners, especially police officers, have a whole lot of power. They have a whole lot of discretion. So with this high level of authority to use force against people, deprive people of life, liberty, perceptions of others and their perceived values became something that we thought was kind of interesting to piece out. So we often view our own behaviors as caused by situational constraints. So what we do is not necessarily always a reflection of exactly who we are, it's kind of situational in nature. But we often view others as caused by some kind of internal or stable disposition. And that kind of got us thinking about how this would reflect with the idea of authoritarianism. So this means that we may feel resentful, that we may feel disappointed in others' behaviors if we feel like they're not acting as they should, or acting like they should in certain situations based on our own perceptions of what they're doing. What this can do is breed aggression. This can breed conflict, which is potentially even more harmful if you have a relationship concerning interactions between police officers and citizens. So for the current survey, we wanted this to mirror Dr. Maloney's activity that she had done in her ethics class as much as possible. Granted, we made some minor adjustments. So we adjust the list of values slightly based upon what she had gotten as feedback concerning understanding of a certain words, certain values that maybe students misunderstood what they meant, so they didn't rank them exactly where they thought they could. Based on that information, based on the research that we had conducted, we tried to do as close as possible with minor adjustments. We also added demographics. With any kind of survey research, we wanted to know specifics about who was taking the survey. So we added things, gender, race, ethnicity. We added academic standing, so freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, as well as primary academic major, so we could find, or see at least, if we could find some differences between these individuals based on some of these demographic variables. So ultimately, we selected 8 majors. They were based on groupings according to generalized employment career path. We then solicited support from department chairs, informed them of our study design, as well as a proposed timeline for when we wanted to get this out. 7 of those majors that we selected were included in the final sample. The survey was created via SurveyMonkey, so a pretty standard online survey tool. And it was sent to all ESU students in those majors as of spring 2018, so during the beginning of the spring semester. We also sent out follow-up emails, so reminder emails, as well as one final reminder, which was kind of a thank you. In addition to that, if individuals wanted to participate in another drawing, they had the option to enter into a drawing for a $25 Amazon gift card to encourage response rate, to encourage individuals to actually want to participate in our survey, hopefully. So preliminary minor results, nothing crazy here. What you see up there is that our sample was predominantly female. So we have roughly 77% female. Something also important to indicate up there is that it tended to weigh heavy on juniors and seniors rather than freshmen and sophomore. That might be explained, perhaps, by the fact that we had a large number of criminal justice students respond to the survey. So we are criminal justice faculty, and chances are pretty good that if you're a junior or senior, you know us. So you've had us multiple times, and maybe you might recognize our name on an email and say, hey, I know this person, let me do the survey. So that might be explained a little bit why there's so many juniors and seniors, perhaps by the fact that we are CJ faculty and there were so many CJ students that did respond. So these were the majors that we had included: business, nursing, political science, social work, biology, psychology, and of course criminal justice. These majors we decided upon to get a good spread. So we wanted to have some comparison here between majors that we thought there might be differences in. We wanted to include some from social sciences, obviously, because we also thought that there might be a connection here, potentially, with those in the helping profession. So if you were a major that was considered a helping profession, we thought there might be some differences there compared to a major that was maybe more hard sciences. We also wanted to include other majors that we knew had focus on ethics, so that we knew had classes that, while they might not be comparable to ours in any way, also talked about ethics in certain ways. So things like business, that we know has an ethical focus. Yep.
So, what else did we find in these results? I suppose this is where it's starting to get a little bit fun, for me, anyway. The first thing that we have here is the criminal justice student value prioritization. So with the start of this survey, again, even as a classroom exercise, if you recall, it was really about starting with the CJ student saying, how would you rank your values in order of importance? It's probably hard to read. I'll sort of explain a little bit about what we're seeing up there. But we did order them, the values here in order of the most important down to least important as they were produced by CJ students. So if you recall, one we indicated was the most important. So the average ranking across respondents who were criminal justice students only, the lowest mean would indicate that it was the most important down to the highest. So among the highest and most important values to criminal justice students were things like health, independence, achievement, emotional well-being, honesty. And we go down the list here, and those things falling at the bottom of the list would be wealth, power, beauty, religion, and recognition. I just wanted to add here at this point, as we go forward and start talking about the values and where they're falling, top, bottom, and how they compare to what we think other people value, we're not making any sort of subjective kind of judgment as to these values or what they mean in this research. We're really going to look at how are they prioritized by certain groups, and how does that compare, again, to how they think other people perceive them. So we're not saying any one or any group of values is good, bad, better than the other. We're interested in just the difference in perception. So I just wanted to make sure to have that there. When we move to the next one, it's the second part of the survey, right? How do criminal justice students believe most others would prioritize their values? Again, I have the chart here. I don't expect you to be able to remember exactly where things fall. But here, what you can at least initially see is there's a different order happening, okay? So let's put them side by side and see what happens. So here's our first chart. I like the color coding. I like the visual test to start with. What we see here is I simply highlighted top 5 for no particular reason other than I said, let's start with the top 5 most important values for criminal justice students, and we see them over here, the ones I just listed a few moments ago. I took the slide over here, criminal justice student rankings of the perceived value of others and highlighted those same 5 where they fall on the other side. Just again, so we can get a visual. So what do we see that's happening here? Definitely a little more spread apart in terms of where they think, how they think others would rank their values. Achievement, independence, health, emotional well-being, 4 of those 5 are still kind of considered to be fairly important to others, but honesty takes a huge dip, which I think was pretty interesting, right? So honesty among the top 5 values to criminal justice students, but at the same time, they think it's not quite as important to others, okay? The next side-by-side that I'll show you highlights the values ranked as least important to CJ majors and to see what their perceptions are regarding the relative importance of those to others. And I think this one actually, again, piqued our interest even more. So when we look at the ones on the bottom, wealth, power, beauty, religion, recognition, even more of a spread. But more importantly, while 2 of them they also believed were down at the bottom in terms of importance to other people, 3 of them, way at the top. So 3 of the 5 values that are the absolute bottom, least important to CJ majors, beauty, wealth, power, they actually think are pretty important to most other people, okay? Now, this is just a visual comparison of where they fall. It's not yet a statistical relationship. So we wanted to move on to that next and say, not just the top or the bottom 5, but in terms of all of these values, statistically, is there a significant relationship? Meaning, is there a statistically significant difference in how they're ranked by CJ students and what they believe other people would do in terms of their rankings? I know a lot of shaded area here. But what this shows is every single item here that's shaded represents a significant relationship. Kind of interesting. We used what's called the Wilcox statistic to compare the mean rankings for each value. And ultimately, what this shows us is that for 15 of the 23 values, criminal justice students believe that most others would rank them as either significantly more important or significantly less important to other people. The more or less is indicated over here in this difference column by either a positive or a negative number. So to pull this out, rather than have you try to sift through all the numbers on that chart, I have here the side-by-side, but in terms of listing them. And Dr. Darno will tell you a little more about the red versus the black numbers here.
So what we have is 6 out of the 15 statistically significant mean ranking comparisons had a positive direction, meaning CJ students believed that others would rank them as significantly more important. Here we see these values pop up again, so beauty, wealth, and power. We also highlighted these in red because as researchers, we were looking at significance, yes, but we wanted to see a mean difference above 3, which are the ones that are highlighted up there. On the other side, we see the remaining 9 of the 15. So these significant mean ranking comparisons had a negative direction, indicating that CJ students believed others would rank them as significantly less important. Those with rankings at least 3 points apart include knowledge, loyalty, family pleasure, safety, wisdom, and honesty. So in all, what we see here is for about 9 of the 23 values in the survey, CJ students believed that most others would rank these values as either significantly more or less important. What we thought of as even a bit more interesting when looking at this, when we set this table up, was the differences between the mean differences. So you see in the column over there where it says others would rank the following values as significantly less, the mean difference is between roughly 3.64 to 5.01. But when we go over to the column over here that says the CJ students would rank the following values as significantly more important than themselves, you see those mean differences jump up. So you see the mean differences go up to 6.41 all the way up to 10.2. So that was something that we thought was interesting as well, just to note that those differences existed. So as far as where this led us, because like I mentioned, we kind of wanted to show you our thought process through this and how it kind of got us to where we are right now with the project. Preliminary results of our research would indicate that at least for CJ students, there's a belief or perception that most other people prioritize their personal values in some very different ways than how they do. So this disparity definitely exists and was something that was intriguing to us. Beauty, wealth, and power specifically seem to be ones that were popping up that seem to be pretty different between where CJ students themselves would rank them and where they thought others ranked them as well. In regard to honesty, CJ students placed pretty high importance on the value, but believed most others did not as well. So this kind of stuff, if you're connecting it to sort of where our research was, may kind of change how you interact with other people. So if you believe that their values are totally different than what your values are, if you believe they value certain things that you don't necessarily value as high, that might impact interactions. That might impact how you view the behavior of other people in potentially negative ways. So this led us to trying to figure out a couple more research questions that kind of just popped up naturally for us. So we wanted to know, are they correct? So are there significant differences in how CJ students and how non-CJ students prioritize their personal values? We also wanted to figure out, correct or not, are they alone? So what we mean by that is, are these students alone in believing that others, or that those others about themselves differ significantly in prioritization of personal values?
So we'll take, our next steps were to go through each question and say, what can we do in terms of looking at the data to get a little bit more information to answer that question. We used a different statistical test that I won't bore you with. And what we did was we looked at CJ students and then all other students in the sample. So any CJ student we compared to all other students, irrespective of major. So it was the CJ, non-CJ. And instead of looking again at CJ students and their perceptions of others, what did the others actually say? And what did that look like? Okay. Rather than put up a bunch of charts with a whole lot of numbers again, I wanted to sort of do this a little bit differently and start by focusing on those items the prior analysis suggested, CJ students thought were going to be significantly different, so that we can look and say, okay, well, are they? Here we can see the actual correlation or relationship between CJ students and all other students. Achievement, recognition, creativity, beauty, power, wealth. All things that CJ students believed would be significantly more important to other people. And as it turns out, for the top 4 there was no difference. Okay? How CJ students prioritize them and where other students prioritize them were really pretty close. Okay? Power and wealth had a very interesting twist to both of those. They were actually shown to be more important to criminal justice majors than they were to non-criminal justice majors. But what I do want to point out is both of those, if you recall, they were in the absolute bottom 5 for CJ majors, so they were not ranked as important to CJ majors. It just happened they were ranked slightly higher than those non-CJ majors who ranked them. So we thought that was pretty interesting. When we look at those items that CJ students thought would be less important, drop my pen, we see here again, knowledge, loyalty, family pleasure, safety, wisdom, honesty, that one that stuck out, and freedom had also no statistically significant difference. All right, so where they fall for CJ students and where they fall for others, very, very similar. Health was actually shown to be more important to others than to CJ majors, but it was also ranked by CJ majors in the top 5. Actually, I believe that was 1. Was that number 1? But they also believed it would be in the top 5 for others. So they didn't think others would not value it or that it would be pretty low. It just statistically came up as being potentially or believed to be different, and it was the reverse. Justice. We weren't sure if we should kind of chuckle at that or be wow or be like, well, that's how it should be. But it turns out justice was the only value that CJ students believed would be significantly more important to them than others, and it turns out they were correct. So for justice, it came out that statistically, CJ students placed a higher priority on that value than did the other students.
Don't let her lie to you. We chuckled about that.
We did. We were like, oh, all right. So
Figures.
probably a good thing, I think, maybe, I don't know. But I said we weren't judging the value, so we're not. We just thought it was fun. Okay. Those values that I just went over, those were the two groups where, remember, CJ students believed there would be a significant difference. So there were a bunch of other values in the survey, so we also did want to take a quick look and see, did any of the other ones actually pop up, even though CJ students didn't think that they would. And there were 4. We had, on the one hand, number 1 and 2, duty and power. They were statistically significantly more important to CJ majors. Didn't fall near the top or bottom. Duty was sort of somewhere in the middle. Power, it was statistically significantly more important to CJ majors. But again, even for CJ majors, it was in the bottom third, but statistically still ended up being a little higher than where other respondents in the survey placed it. 3 and 4, love and emotional well-being, those two actually were statistically significantly more important to others than they were to CJ majors. Love was ranked by CJ majors, though, as in their top group, and they also believed it was fairly high for others. But again, for the others, it just happened to end up a little bit higher, statistically. And emotional well-being was significantly more important to others, but ranked by CJ majors, again, in the top group for themselves and others. Okay, so it was high up there for both. It was high up there in terms of being perceived important to others, but statistically, the others sort of had a little bit higher or more importance placed on it. So the question 2.
So for now, what we're looking at with question 2 is correct or not. Are they alone in believing that those other than themselves are going to have differences in regard to value prioritization? So our previous analysis indicated there were a total of 15 value items that CJ students believed they prioritized differently, statistically significantly differently than most others. When we completed a similar analysis on the entire sample, which was going to combine CJ and non-CJ students, this is where we looked at how respondents ranked the values for themselves as compared to how they believed most others would rank them. We found that for 7 of those 15, it turns out that CJ students were not alone in their perceptions. So with respect to honesty, knowledge, loyalty, and justice, all respondents, not just CJ students, believe that most others would value these significantly less. With respect to wealth, power, and recognition, all respondents believe that most others would value these significantly more. In here, this slide is simply going to highlight that of those 7, the only value with less than a 3-point average that I mentioned earlier, average difference in ranking, was justice. So again, justice pulling out for some reason.
So in terms of these 2 questions, we had to take a step back. Well, we weren't standing, we were probably sitting, but we had to kind of sit back for a second and say, what is this saying? Because we really were like, wow, okay, let's try to put in words what we were just seeing here and why we're sitting here thinking that this is actually pretty interesting stuff. So we went back to that first question. We went to looking at criminal justice students and remembering we started all this because it was an exercise in really looking at, our students, the ones in our classes, the ones that, we have, the responsibility to kind of put through this, ethics course and say, what is it about their perception? They're going out there in the world, they're going to have discretion and power, and let's figure out what your lens is. How are you going out there and viewing other people? Do you have a difference in your perception? And so our initial analysis, though, suggested there really is a clear belief that most other people prioritize their values in very different ways. Some of the strongest perceived differences, as we mentioned, were that wealth, power, and beauty. And so again, we were trying not to give meaning to those particular values. But I mentioned, I think in one of my classes, and a few of my students are in here, that I did in one particular semester. I wanted to really illustrate some of this in maybe a funny or engaging way. I'm not really sure how successful I was, but I took the values that ended up on the top and bottom and put them on a pretend like Match.com profile, and I was like, well, if you came across this one and it said, I'm really interested in wealth and power and beauty, and that's a lot more important to me than honesty or my family or my emotional well-being, I'm like, are you gonna wink at that person? I'm not sure. So I'm not characterizing these, but the question is sort of, does this give us a moment, or does this make us pause and think, right, about the lenses, and is that important to us? And then when we added in the non-CJ students and we compared those things, again, there were some exceptions, but overall what we found is no statistically significant differences in how these two groups actually prioritize their values. So they weren't correct. Okay, they weren't correct. CJ students perceive most others to prioritize values very significantly differently, but they're not really spot on that. And then when we get to the second piece, the second question in that, it turns out CJ students, in fact, are not alone. So despite the initial research that sort of contextualized the study that we were doing that had to do with personality types that are drawn to and are interested in certain majors, it really didn't matter. That didn't seem to be coming into play, because when we put all students in the survey to compare self versus what they think others would do, it's pretty much everyone has this same view that the way other people prioritize their values is different than their own. And in fact, there was a lot of overlap as far as the exact same values that they think other people place a lot more importance on. So the belief or perception that most others prioritize their personal values in significantly different ways is not specific to criminal justice majors. It's more of a generalized perception shared by all respondents, irrespective of their major. We thought that was pretty interesting. So what we did was we had to return a little bit to the literature and think about other ways to really contextualize these findings, because ultimately we realized what we were looking at initially, that's not really it. That's not really what's going on, and that's not going to help us figure out where to go next with it. We drew instead on some literature. There's this body of literature, it's called the Focal Concerns perspective with sentencing. And basically, focal concerns is a theory in criminology. It had to do with crime and the commission of crime. Steffensmeyer and colleagues applied it a little bit differently. They applied it to sentencing decisions by judges, and really what they were looking at is when judges depart from using sentencing guidelines that they're supposed to use, what are the reasons for that? And so they explore this idea of focal concerns. What that says is that decision makers in the area of criminal justice, generally speaking, are concerned with three main things: the blameworthiness or the culpability of the offender, public safety, and then there are always practical constraints and consequences to the decision making. The first item there is the one that seems the most relevant, the blameworthiness, culpability of the offender. So when tasked, again, with decision making, in these contexts, we're talking about criminal justice officials coming across those who might be, potential criminals, or those who are, violating the rules or the laws in some ways. When they use their discretion or they make some of these decisions, are they making it based on a real assessment of their blameworthiness, culpability, or does it often happen that they have to make these quick decisions? They don't have all the information to really assess somebody's blameworthiness, and they rely on what's called perceptual shorthand. Perceptual shorthand is basically like heuristics. It's a heuristics approach to looking at decision-making by officials. And heuristics is basically, it's mental shortcuts. How do we sort of access these ideas or notions we have in our mind sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, to make decisions. And a lot of times this literature is discussed in terms of figuring out or trying to find out why you can have disparities in sentencing, disparities in, at various decision points in the CJ process, even when sometimes they're using guides, if they are using sentencing guidelines, because we can include these sort of internal biases that we have in our decision-making process. So why is all this sort of making sense to us in the moment? Because here we're talking about this survey that's looking at CJ students, but also non-CJ students, right? And what's coming out is that everyone seems to have this lens, this belief, right, this perception that all other people, most other people, however they thought of that in terms of when they were doing the survey, they just value things very differently, that they don't place as much importance on certain things as we do. So take out of the picture, at least to begin with, the would-be or potential criminal, right? Because we didn't talk about that in the survey. We didn't ask them about criminals. We just said most others. So if we already have this idea, right, we have this lens that people prioritize and value things really different than ourselves, are we already starting out having these cognitive biases in our mind before we get to the decision making, before we even encounter an individual who we suspect might have violated the law? So add into that, the other aspects that we talked about in terms of, law enforcement, courts, corrections, policing, and the other factors that will go into influencing decision making. Which leads us to sort of the implication. So what does this all say to us, at least at this point, before we get to our next steps, or what we hope to be our next steps?
What interested us about this research, of course, were all results that we got that we were really excited about and didn't necessarily think were going to come back the way they did, but kind of thought maybe they would. The thing that interested us even more than that were the potential implications. So what this could mean and what we sort of thought that this might mean. As far as curriculum-related implications, authoritarianism, which is thought of as being as part of the police personality, has been shown to be dampened by education. So specifically, completing a bachelor's degree was shown to dampen this idea of authoritarianism. This is especially significant for criminal justice majors, as police departments have promoted this idea that there's a possibility of completing 60 credits prior to applying, and that's all you need to complete. Well, research would suggest that actually that's not quite enough, and you need the entire bachelor's degree to actually have that impact this potential for authoritarianism to show up within the police personality and possibly do some or cause some difficulty. Research also suggests that departments create a curriculum that promotes critical thinking, that promotes tolerance, and appreciation for interdisciplinary views, combined with CJ to combat any of the negative associations that the police subculture or police personality might have. As far as ethics courses, research is pretty mixed. So at best, research is mixed with respect to ethics courses and trainings having a significant or lasting impact on individuals' ethical decision-making. It also is going to look at sort of how much is important or the delivery of it in regard to ethics courses. So research regarding ethics as a standalone class or having ethics infused through the curriculum. That's kind of the question as far as what would be more useful. How much is going to focus specifically on, how is going to focus specifically on criminal justice related ethics. So as far as ethical standards of specific criminal justice organizations versus one that discusses more so philosophical roots of ethics, a more generalized approach that encourages more critical thinking. So our research, we feel, lends itself to support rethinking the goals of an ethics course. So perhaps we have been off mark in attempting to create curriculum to teach, and perhaps it is more about perceptions. So some research has noted that knowing what the correct answer is to an ethical situation that might be discussed in class does not necessarily indicate that that person would actually do that in that situation. So it's all sort of, in this situation, what do you think you might do? It's all hypothetical. So if you read a situation, an ethical scenario in class that's criminal justice related, and you say, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna respond this way. Part of that might be, well, you know what she wants you to answer. And part of that might be, well, I think that this is the right answer. But in that actual situation, how truthful is that? How honest is it that you will respond in this way? Having it not be a hypothetical, having it be split-second decision, when you need to instantly figure out, based on the situation, what you're gonna do, having all this authority and power that we mentioned, that might make things a bit more different. So it would seem that efforts might be better focused on curriculum in our classes that focus more on breaking down assumptions that we all tend to make about other people. Because, like our research suggested, it's not just CJ students. So everyone makes these assumptions about everyone else. So breaking down those assumptions concerning why we think other people do things, or what they value, or the motive behind their behaviors, their value system, might have more of an impact. Certainly trying to explore how we can increase students' overall knowledge, understanding, and empathy for others. So all that it should be, in our opinions at least, guided by this research, part of what this ethics would include. Maybe if we can address some of this, ethical decision-making will naturally follow in criminal justice as well as in other fields.
And so with that, we not only thought it was pretty interesting and maybe a little contrary to what we thought was going to happen, or at least it started to go in a different direction. You know, we did have some limitations clearly that I'll talk about for a second, and then our next steps and future research as well. As far as limitations, obviously it's not generalizable. Our findings were limited to students here. We had about 322 surveys come in, and when we showed you the response rates and demographics, certainly not completely representative of even ESU students, let alone a broader population. So we're not trying to draw those conclusions. We do have the issue, survey items were not predefined for respondents. We did leave out a few that I said early on. I think, you know, what were they, altruism? Sometimes students ended up just throwing it in at the bottom, and this was based on when I did it in the classroom after the fact. I would debrief with students, and they gave me the feel, oh, I didn't really know what you meant by that, so I just put it at the bottom. So we tried to remove some that we thought could potentially cause that issue. Nonetheless, things weren't defined, so you know, how one student versus another in their mind was sort of thinking a particular value was what we were sort of getting at could potentially be an issue. In particular, and this is also something that came up when I was doing the survey with students in class, we didn't define for them who most others were. And I knew going into it that that would be a limitation. Again, having done the survey in the class, I would always ask them, okay, tell me who the others were in your mind when you were completing this survey. And I actually did get varied responses. But I still felt it important not to define that in the survey. So it's gonna be a question mark here that I'm not sure exactly how or in what ways we could address that in the future. I had students say things like, well, I just thought about other students in my major, other students in my class, or really, I just thought about our general society based on media and television and things like that, just general perceptions of US society. And some people are like, oh, I was just thinking about my family and my friends. So that's going to sort of produce very different responses. So I was hoping ultimately to just sort of still leave that with the respondent, knowing that that could be it's a limitation. The rankings, again, we talked about are relative importance. So for respondent number one, for instance, they could say, well, these 5 values are important to me. None of the others are important at all. So the top 5 are there and then the rest are down there, but somebody could feel they're all important. So it's value ranking is relative, and so, we wanted to leave it that way. Potentially in future surveys, we could have them rank each thing individually on a scale of like 1 to 5, how important, to get a different gauge. But we wanted to, again, mirror the original survey to see if the at least existing patterns or the initial patterns were prevalent. And there was still some potential evidence in looking at the data of what we call survey fatigue, meaning by the end of doing at least even that second round of rankings, they just kind of start, oh, well, we'll just throw these down here. So that could potentially be an issue as well that we could address. Next steps in future research. Next steps, we've already started some of them. We don't have those preliminary results here, but what we did, if you recall from the beginning, we said we were interested in also looking at how these results might be, there might be interaction effects with things like gender, with things like race or ethnicity. Academic standing is something that has been in the literature as well. We did see research suggesting like freshmen as opposed to seniors will prioritize things a little bit differently and have different sort of judgments on values and ethical decision making. So we do want to look at that in a lot more detail, as well as actually break up the others, the other majors, because as of right now, we have everybody all together, or we have the CJ, non-CJ. So we would like to look at the individual majors as well. We started to do that, I will tell you. Interestingly, maybe not, we are starting to see some gender-specific differences. So we enlisted the help of Dr. Roski in that, because now the stats are officially getting even beyond what I'm used to doing, because again, this is starting to go in areas and in combinations of things that we just didn't necessarily think were gonna happen. And so we were pretty excited about it. We didn't want that to stop us, so we're gonna keep going with that as well. And we would like to ultimately expand the sample, and that gets, again, to generalizability. So, of course, ideally, we could sample the whole university, add other universities or, university types, things like that. So, those possibilities are, potentially endless as far as combinations. But I think, in terms of this study, it's so far fairly unique. We couldn't quite find anything like it in the literature that really looked at this whole perception. There are things related to perception out there outside of criminal justice and in other disciplines. And so one of the things we've been doing is drawing upon that as well. But within the field of criminal justice and the CJ-specific literature, there does seem to be that gap. There's either a focus when it comes to looking at ethics and values on as Dr. Darno was mentioning, people who are attracted to the major to begin with, and how have we measured, and what personality types tend to be associated with criminal justice majors or law enforcement officers, and again, all of that stuff being mixed. And then the research on ethics courses and delivery being mixed, we kind of feel like we're starting to see something here, something potential as far as a little bit of a gap that we might be filling, something maybe we were missing, and it was really, less about personality types and major and more generalized in terms of what's going on with all of, people today having very different ideas about what other people value, and saying, all of us on any given day don't necessarily act, behave, or make decisions that are 100% consistent with our own values. And so maybe giving other people the benefit of that doubt as well, rather than assuming they don't value something, saying, maybe they actually do, but maybe what I just saw happen, doesn't necessarily reflect that, because as we keep adding more others to the survey, we keep finding more consistency between, CJ students, non-CJ students, in what they actually do value versus what they perceive others to value. And so, not wanting everyone to walk around out there thinking everybody else, thinks values like honesty and love and emotional well-being are way less important than beauty, success, wealth, and power, it would probably be good to break that down. And so that's sort of the direction we went, which is not where we thought we were initially going. And that is about it. Any questions? Yes. Hi.
Now maybe I missed this, but you were doing, looking at what CJ majors valued and what they perceived others to.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do that going the other way with the others, what they value and what they perceive CJ majors to value?
We did not, because when we did the survey, the same survey was sent to everyone. And so what we did was we looked at, as you said, CJ students, what they value and what they perceive most others to value. So when you look at the most others, so all the other majors, we did then look at what did they actually say they valued, and we also looked at, and what do they perceive others? But for them, others was still general, not what do you perceive CJ majors to value.
It's gonna be kind of interesting to know what they perceive CJ majors in value. Why is this person going in there?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So,
Yeah,
for sure.
you know.
probably. I'm sure that would be, anecdotally, you do hear people think, have various ideas about, and any major, why people go into any different major. So yeah, but we didn't ask that. I didn't even think of that.
Neither did I. Could be interesting though.
Yes.
You said, if I recall correctly, this survey was done last spring?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just curious whether the results would have been any different if they'd done it a year earlier, just because of the polarization based on the national political scene, and are the others now being redefined because we're seeing really polar opposites of that instead of more moderation. I don't know if they could consider that at all with that election.
I actually agree wholeheartedly with that. I do think that, and we didn't talk about it, here. It did come up in our conversation, sort of wondering if it is a reflection of sort of what
Society is.
Yeah, what we have seen going on. I do feel, and I guess, I don't know if it's anecdotal or not, but I do feel society has become very polarized. And maybe not 1 year, 2 year, but even if you go back 5, 6, 7, 10 years, would we see something very different? I couldn't say. I think it'd be a hard thing to try and figure out, but it's definitely should be part of the conversation of putting it, in a historical context to make sure, none of this happens in a vacuum. So certainly we have these ideas for a reason. And so whether they've always existed or whether it is something new, I can tell you at least as far back as 2012, when I was just doing it in my small classrooms, and it was only CJ students, I still kept seeing the same thing. Those students still kept believing there was a pretty big difference. The actual values and where they fell, they were a little bit different here and there, but were by and large pretty similar. But again, that was very limited. I can't really draw any meaningful conclusions from that.
I don't know if I have a question so much as an observation, and I just want to hear your thoughts on it. But as I'm sitting here thinking of beauty, power, and wealth, it occurs to me those are all things that I can and do regularly judge by other people based on what I see. Things like honesty and loyalty, trustworthiness, I can't look at you and know that. So
Yep.
as you're moving forward, is part of it maybe just a comfort level with, well, I can see how much they put on fashion, or I can see that uniform and what that entails. And if I can make that judgment about others maybe elevate that.
Yeah, I do think, I think you're right. We talked a little bit about that, and some of the literature talked about that too, the visible versus, the values that you can't see. I think that comes into play also when I was talking about, any one of us on our best day doesn't always behave. So, the visual part, behave or act in a way that necessarily reflects what we value the most. And recognizing that we don't do that, somehow can we help folks understand that when you do see someone else, there's something there too. So I guess what I'm saying with that is there really is that element of, recognizing the things that you can't see versus the things that you can see, and the behaviors you see versus all the other behaviors that person has engaged in that you don't see, and, various other, things people have thought of along those lines, like, not defining a person by their, the worst thing I'm not the worst thing I've ever done. All of those kind of things I think are all part of this, and I also think that's why this became more complex than I think we even thought in the beginning. But yeah, no, I do. I appreciate that. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You didn't talk about this in limitations, but I know all the principles and values are supposed to be objective, but I feel like culture very often puts a morality on certain values. Like, people are kind of criticized for trying to get to the top too fast, like for power or for wealth. Like, people associate greed with that, so they're not necessarily, there could be social desirability in those answers.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, of course I value honesty over like being beautiful, but
Yeah, and it's tricky with this. When we did send the survey out, we did think about the social desirability aspect of responding to surveys. It's a tough one to get around in terms of trying to make that not part of it. The survey itself was, respondents were completely anonymous and told that they were. The only way they might be able to be identified is if they wanted to enter the drawing for the gift card, but that was only so we could give them the gift card. So we tried to temper that a little bit, but I still feel personally that people, even if they know something, their name is not tied to something, again, they're still maybe reporting what the right answers are supposed to be. I agree, absolutely.
And we did talk specifically even about power, about how power might not mean the same thing to everybody, and how power might have a negative connotation. And if we were looking at like power in that way, like the power thing, or if we were looking at responding to authority, or how we could potentially phrase things different to try to capture different elements. So, I mean, it was definitely something that we thought of as far as even just the terminology goes. Like, what does this word mean culturally, socially to certain people?
Well, I think that's also why when I was going back and forth on, do we keep it a full list that then they rank the whole thing versus do we have each individual item and say how important is each one to you? The ranking at least allows a person to say, they don't have to say success is important to me, but they can say my family is always more important than success. Or, so it's sort of the ranking. That was one of the benefits of having them rank. They don't have to say that's not important or that is. It's just a matter of them ranking what, relative, to each other. Doesn't leave it out entirely though, because they can still, again, that sort of desirability. Well, love and family is supposed to be up here, so I'm going to put that up here and keep going this way.
You mentioned health being the top. I mean, we might all rank health towards the top, but that doesn't mean that we do healthy things every day, even though we think that it's a value that society says we think should be always near the top.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be interesting if you did this same survey with actual police officers to see how it equaled out between what police officers think and what the criminal justice students are thinking. Just
Crossed my mind, then I got a little scared of that idea.
Even with cadets.
It would be interesting
Yeah.
because in the profession itself, sometimes that does change you.
Yeah.
And with people coming into or thinking about coming into the profession, they may have a whole totally different perception than what it really is. And getting the statistics from actual police officers versus what CJ students think, I think would be really interesting to see how close or how far off they really are.
Even with cadets, we had thought. So cadets, when they first enter the academy compared to when they get out of the academy.
Or a year later.
Or a year later.
Because it is a big, I'm retired, but it was a big difference for me to go in, and it's very wide eye-opening in the academy versus when you come out and you're doing stuff and you suddenly have this realization of power.
And that really did interest us a lot because CJ students, some of them, most of them maybe perhaps, are going into law enforcement, but not all of them. So we have a lot of CJ students that are going to go into corrections, probation, courts in some way, or nothing at all related to criminal justice, and that's perfectly acceptable. So it was kind of hard for us. We had sort of an attention to policing because the majority of our students are involved in policing or want to be involved in policing, but we can't assume that that's the entire sample of CJ students.
Well, if you recall too, I mean, a lot of our early literature, when we were talking about it, really was always focused on policing and police personality and police subculture. So there's been a lot of kind of thought and research in that general area, whether they come in with certain ideas and ideals, and then what happens once they're socialized into policing and how do their attitudes and beliefs change there. And so I think that, again, some of that, I think ours departed from that. So I still think, it could be something interesting to have this type of survey done with, specifically with law enforcement or even within other CJ professions as well, because the existing research on that other stuff isn't quite this. It's a little bit different. It's really focused on, other areas of the whole personality. And we're not inventorying or trying to kind of describe personality or assess personality. It's really just about the disconnect between sort of, again, what you value and just our perceptions of everyone else, rather than let's kind of figure out who you are as a police officer. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I was really interested in justice and in different ways that individuals might define justice. And I see that one of the things you want to address going forward are definitions. And I don't know exactly, what you mean by that. But in justice, for example, I can see where one person might see it as from primarily a punishment perspective, where the idea of justice is that wrongdoers get punished, okay, and justifiably so. Whereas others might see it mainly from a fairness perspective of, you got to make sure that everybody has, is fairly treated under the law. And then yet others might see it primarily as from a human rights perspective. And then I'm sure there are a lot of others as well. And so I just wondered what your take was on that, and how different students might interpret that, and even how different disciplines would interpret that.
Yeah, it comes up actually in my classes a lot, whether it be intro or the ethics class, because I do ask them, what is justice to you? And I find there is, on the one hand, a tendency, and maybe, again, I don't teach non-CJ students, so I guess I don't have that perspective, but there is always a tendency when I ask what justice is to very specifically refer to the criminal justice system. I mean, it has the word justice in it. They're criminal justice majors, so they are interested in that very specific concept of justice. But I think you're right, perhaps with other majors or more generally, justice isn't necessarily about crime and the law, but it's a more of a social, a social justice perspective. As far as the definitions moving forward, honestly, we don't know yet how we might address that. On the one hand, having a list of 23 values and having a very specific definition for each, I don't know that would work very well. At the same time, there's value to respondents being on the same page about what they're doing with their rankings. At the same time, there's something to be said for them having, it coming from them. What does it mean to you? And therefore, based on that meaning, where do you place it? We just don't know that. One way that sort of was interesting to me, and we didn't do it for this, but when I do it in the classroom, is I have these debriefs with the students. I ask them to give me that feedback. And so maybe, it would be something worthy of exploring moving forward if we could set up, solicit respondents maybe participating in a focus group after to sort of go over the survey, short of, again, giving them definitions. And we also tried to shorten the list, and it was like, well, if we have a shorter list, maybe we could give definitions, but ultimately we didn't really want to leave things out. But this is, I mean, that's definitely something we do need to try to figure out if we are lucky enough to get the chance to try and replicate this, you know, at a different level, because I think we'd have some interesting findings, or continue to have them.
And I think that's a good point with justice, with different majors specifically, because it's going to mean something entirely different to criminal justice students than it might mean to business students or bio students. Any other questions?
All right. Any other questions?
No? Well, then, thank
Yep,
you,
thank you
everyone,
very much.
for coming. Our contact information's there. Certainly, if you have any questions or wanted to talk about it more, we're available. And if you didn't get one or we're all out, please pick up a pack of M&Ms on your way out.